Joining us to discuss the recent rise in tensions in Syria is Dr. Martin Sherman, the founder and executive director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, what are your initial reactions to the tit-for-tat that's been going on between Syrian and Israeli forces?
Well, I think this could be the sign of a dangerous escalation. I think the Syrian factor here is probably the more minor. The problem is, does this escalate into a confrontation with other powers there, mainly Iran and Russia? And I think that places Israel in a very delicate situation, and I can only hope that at least with the Russians, there's some sort of coordination. Obviously, with the Iranians, there isn't.
So how much do you think this is going to be mentioned in the meetings that we're seeing between the defense ministers, the Russian defense minister and Avigdor Lieberman?
Well, I'm sure the question of coordination, I would at least would hope that the question of coordination with the Russians would take a very major portion of the discussions, because that's crucial. I mean, we really don't want to get into a physical confrontation with the Russians.
Right, but you know, obviously Israel is now setting red lines of sorts, and the question is Russia going to be happy with what Israel is planning on doing in the future when it comes to dealing with the threat from Syria?
Well, I'm not sure that Israeli interests and Russian interests are identical. I'm just hoping that we can coordinate and explain to the Russians that our only reason for freedom of operation in the skies of over Lebanon and Syria is to protect our own sovereign territory and our own citizens. And I can only hope that the Russians will understand that.
Well, we're hoping that, right? So now let's talk about those red lines a little bit, and who's setting them?
Well, I don't know whose red lines you mean. I think Israel has its own red lines, and one of them should be and must be freedom of action over the skies of Lebanon and Syria. Even this is some sort of infringement of their sovereignty. You know, you may raise the question: does Syria have the right to protect the sovereignty of its skies? Or probably it does, but Israel has the duty, on the other hand, to use them to collect the intelligence and generate the operational freedom that it needs. But under this particular instance, I understand the planes weren't even over Syria; they were over Lebanon, and this might have been a misunderstanding on the Syrian parts, on the part of Syria, which shows how easily things can escalate into violence.
Well, here's the question. I mean, do you see Israel continuing to operate as normal per se despite this latest conflict, or are we going to see a major change in what's happening on the ground?
Well, in the short run, I think we'll see Israel carrying on operating in this way. I don't think it has much option. Whether it can generate alternatives through satellites or cooperation with the Americans or other things like that, at least for intelligence collection, I don't see much other option if it's going to be things beyond intelligence collection, like operational strikes against arms convoys and things like that, as we've seen in the past. I think that what this does show is that the Syrians are ever more confident in their ability to respond, because up until now there have been numerous attacks in Syrian territory and there's been no response, even though Israel hasn't always accepted responsibility for them. But I mean, normally the consensus is that it was Israel who struck. So this might show that the Assad regime is becoming more and more confident and feels that he can build on the support of maybe the Russians and certainly the Iranians, which of course goes away to say how lucky we are we didn't give back the Golan.
All right. Well, Dr. Martin Sherman, thank you so much for joining us, and we're just going to have to wait and see what happens next, right?
Thank you.
All right.